Hello, everybody. This is Paul Hicks. I'm going to talk to you today about John Locke. In particular, we're going to talk about an essay concerning human understanding. John Locke is probably one of the most influential philosophers. He comes out of the modern era. He's a 17th century philosopher. There's two major works that we're going to discuss when talking about John Locke. The first one is an essay concerning human understanding, which we'll get to in just a bit. That's what this video is on. And the second one we're going to do next week, which is a second treatise of government. And that's going to be his political philosophy. All right, so let's go ahead and start talking about an essay concerning human understanding. So as you know, there's been two camps when it comes to understanding what knowledge is in the history of philosophy up until this time. That is, we have the rationalists and we have the empiricists. The rationalists, you're going to see people like Plato and Descartes. The rationalists have argued that all knowledge derives out of reason, and you don't actually need any sort of experience or any sensory data in order to understand or to know something. That is, these ideas are innate to us. They are imprinted upon our mind. It is something that we can just simply understand just by thinking. So if you look at Plato, Plato had this idea that all learning was recollection, if you remember, and that all you had to do was think about a topic for a moment, and you'll be able to understand what it is because you don't need any experience with it. You know everything already. All ideas are innate, and you don't need to learn anything. You just need to recollect it. Similar with Descartes. We're not going to say that Descartes got his knowledge derived, say, from the external world, because if you read the first Meditations, he says that we don't even know if the external world exists. And so we certainly can't rely that it does exist, and we certainly can't rely on senses that tell us the external world exists, because that's just not reliable. Our senses have lied to us. Our senses, tell us falsehoods all the time. So, for example, if you were to look up at the sun for just a moment, don't take too long, but it appears to be about the size of a quarter from here. Now you realize that the sun is, of course, many more times bigger than the earth you're standing on, but it appears because it's so far away. Now if you were to look solely at our sensory data, what you would say is that the sun is actually very, very small, right? So according to Descartes, we can't rely on that type of stuff, all right? And so, all knowledge, he says, cannot come from experience. Knowledge must come from reasoning and reasoning alone. So now let's get into John Locke and his essay concerning human understanding. And let's try to see what Locke is ultimately trying to do. So, we're trying to inquire, he says, into the origin, certainty, and the extent of human knowledge, and also into the grounds and degrees of any sort of belief, opinion, and assent to those types of beliefs. So let's just start with some brute facts when we start talking about thinking. Number one, humans in fact think. This is a brute fact, he says. This seems to be self-evident. It is obvious to us. There's also other things that we have. We have these things called opinions. We think certain things are true, and we think certain things are false. And when we think about our opinions, we can notice a few things. So imagine, if you could, that an alien space race came down to Earth and looked at all of humanity and all of humankind. And they discovered that we had opinions. What is it, from an outside perspective, would allow them to understand what those opinions are? Well, one, they seem to be various, right? Our opinions vary. We have some opinions in one country, but they have different opinions, say, in another culture or a different country. And so our opinions vary. They are different from each other. The other thing is that they're often contradictory. That is, I might believe something to be true, but you're going to believe that it's going to be false. Now, we can't both be right. So the examples I've given in class have been, some of you believe that God exists, and some of you believe God does not exist. Well, one of you is right and one of you is wrong. They can't both be right, right? A contradiction can't possibly be true. So here's what Locke's project ultimately is. He wants to answer the following question, and it's this. When we are concerned with something about which we have no certain knowledge, What rules or standards should guide how confident we allow ourselves to be that our opinions are right? So in order to understand this, we have to first understand what is our thinking. Well, our thinking consists of what he calls an idea. We have these ideas in our mind. But how is it that we become equipped with these ideas? So if you go back to the rationalists with people like Plato and with Descartes, right, we're born with this, they're imprinted upon the mind. All we have to do is uncover them through reason. Right? Locke's going to challenge that very notion. Right? When we know, it's important to understand this because it gives the example of saying when you know your muscular strength, you know what physical tasks we can attempt to accomplish with any sort of hope and success. Well, similarly, we need to understand the limits of our reason so we know what we can know to be true and what we can know to be false. So let's go ahead and talk about ideas and what is an idea. Well, an idea is some sort of mental content. Right? It's something that is in your mind. Locke understands the word to stand for what he says is, quote, whatever is the object of the understanding when a man thinks. So we all believe that ideas exist in the minds of men. We are all conscious of them in ourselves. The words and actions of other people tell us that they seem to have ideas as well. Therefore, the very first question that we need to ask ourselves is how is it that they actually come into our mind? So I'm going to look at book 1 here, chapter 2, and he's going to argue against what he calls innate speculative principles in the mind. So, he brings up the idea that many have considered the existence of innate principles in the minds of men. We're told that these thoughts are printed on the mind when it comes into existence and that it just brings in the world with it. Right? Well, Locke wants to show, is it possible that we can create these ideas in a way which are in fact not innate? And how would that in fact be? What's going to make that work? Locke shows how man can get all knowledge they have and can arrive at certainty about some things purely by using natural abilities. Right? He says, quote, nothing is more commonly taken for granted than that certain principles, both speculative, that is, having to do with what is the case, and practical, that is, having to do with some sort of morality, or what ought to be the case, are accepted by all mankind. Some people have argued that because these principles they think are universally accepted, they must have been stamped into the souls of men from outset. That is, these are natural ideas that are built into the very constitution of our brain. So principles here are universally accepted, and that therefore they must have been stamped onto the souls of men from the outset, and therefore rationalism, not empiricism, but rationalism is in fact correct. Locke argues that this argument from universal consent has a defect in it. Even if it were in fact true that all mankind agreed in accepting certain truths, that wouldn't prove them to be innate if universal agreement could be explained in some other way, and he thinks he can do that. And so let's go about how he does that. So let's look at the argument from universal consent for rationalism. That's used to prove that there are innate principles that can be turned into a proof that there are none. Because there aren't any principles to which all mankind give universal assent. Do you understand it? There are no principles, according to Locke, to which all mankind give universal consent. So let's go ahead and take a couple very simple, speculative, logical principles. Let's take the statement of whatever is. Right? It's a very simple statement. Whatever exists, exists. Whatever there is, that is what there is. This seems to be an analytic truth that cannot be denied and that everybody would assent to. And let's also take another statement. It is impossible for the same thing to be and not to be. Is that true? It is impossible for the same thing to be and not to be. These are so widely held to be true propositions that it is thought that they are therefore innate. And could really anybody ever doubt these propositions? Well, Locke argues that these propositions are in fact not accepted by everyone because a great part of mankind have never heard of them. And so this is one of his most popular arguments, is what he calls the children and idiots argument. That is, children and idiots do not have any inklings of these principles. So for example, I have a 1-year-old daughter. I don't think my 1-year-old daughter is thinking whatever is, or it is impossible for the same thing to be and not to be. She probably doesn't know that. And this is really important, because if these were innate ideas, even my 1-year-old daughter would have to know such a thing. But the fact is, he says, that children don't seem to have any inkling of these principles whatsoever, and that fact alone is enough to destroy the universal assent that any truth is innate. Right? Because it would be a contradiction to say that there are truths imprinted on the soul or on the mind that it doesn't perceive or understand, because, well, if imprinting means anything, it means making something be perceived. How can something be imprinted on the mind yet the mind not know it? What would that mean when we're talking about some sort of idea? Right? So that doesn't make any sense. So if we are to say that children and idiots have souls and minds with those principles imprinted on them, then it would be the case that they can't help but perceive them and assent to them. The fact is, they don't do that. Therefore, according to Locke, it's evident that the principles are not innately impressed upon our minds, because if they were naturally imprinted and thus innate, how could they be unknown, right? If an idea is innate, it must be known. The mind must know of it. Otherwise, what does it make of an idea? Because an idea is mental content. So it may be said, of course, that a proposition that the mind has never consciously known may be in the mind, in the sense that the mind is capable of knowing it. But with this understanding, every proposition that is in the mind, because I can come to know any proposition, even a false one. Right? This would include, I can know propositions that would include truths that the person never did and never will know. I may not know to the 100th degree of pi, but I could conceive of it, and it could become a proposition in my mind even if I didn't know it. And that would be really kind of weird if we're going back to innate ideas and we're saying, you know, once again, it's something in the mind that you don't actually know. It's just something you can come to know, but you don't really know it. So if the mere ability to know is the natural impression that philosophers are arguing for, then all the truths a man ever comes to know will have to count as innate. But here's the thing. Empiricists don't deny that the mind was capable of knowing many truths. Empiricists accept that the capacity for knowledge is innate, right? But to actually have the propositions that we are said that we know are not innate. That's what the empiricists are arguing. Not that we don't have a capacity for knowledge. We absolutely do. You know, a lot of this comes down to this idea that it would just be a contradiction to be in the understanding and not to be understood. What does that mean? And as we talked about earlier in the semesters, contradictions are always false. There's no way you can make a contradiction true, right? So we are told then that thus to be in the understanding and not be understood, that is to be in the mind but never be perceived, amounts to saying something is not in the mind or in the understanding as well as it is in the mind and in the understanding, and that's once again a contradiction. So that can't possibly be true. If therefore these two propositions, that as we gave earlier, whatsoever is, or it's impossible for the same thing to be and not to be, if they are imprinted by nature, children cannot possibly be ignorant of them. Infants and all that have souls must necessarily have them in their understandings, know the truth of them, and assent to their actual truth. But this is not the actual case that we find ourselves with. Some would object that some answer that all men know and assent to these truths when they come to the use of reason, and that when everybody will assent to it when you come to the use of reason itself. And this is supposed to be enough to prove that all truths are innate. Here's Locke's response to that. People are in a grip of prejudice. We accept so much as being true and we never question it, right? We have certain prejudices. And they don't look carefully at what they say. They'll say things that are meaningless, and they pass them off as being clear reasons. If those who believe innateness is proved by assent when reason is reached, there's two things that you must hold. One, that as soon as men come to the use of reason, these supposedly innate truths come to be known and observed by them. Or, two, that the use and exercise of men's reason assists them in the discovery of these truths, making them known with certainty. Well, let's say they mean two. That by the use of reason, men may discover these principles, and that this is sufficient, this is alone, is enough to prove that they are therefore innate. Well, if that's the case, then you're arguing for the following conclusion, he says. Whatever truths reason can enable us to know for certain and make us firmly assent to are all innate. That is, they're naturally imprinted upon the mind. That is what the rationalist must claim. But you're claiming this on the grounds that universal assent itself proves innateness, and that all we mean by something's being universally assented to in this context is merely that we can come to know it for sure and be brought to the assent to it by the use of reason. But if this is the case, then this line of thought wipes out the distinction between even the basic axioms of mathematics and the theorems that we deduce from those axioms. Many of you probably at some point in time had to do some sort of natural deduction in mathematics. Maybe you had to prove the Pythagorean's theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Is that an innate idea? Right? Is that axioms or those theorems? Are they innate ideas? They all have to count equally as innate because they can all be known for certain through the use of reason. But this is like saying we need reason to make our eyes discover visible objects. The idea that reason shows us those truths that have been imprinted amounts to saying that the use of reason enables a man to learn what he already knew. And what does that mean to say that you learn what you already knew? That seems to be rather absurd, and so we could go ahead and get rid of it there. And so Locke says, I can no more make sense of a truth being innate and yet not assented to than I can of a man's knowing the truth while being ignorant of it. All right? So think about that for just a bit. I can no more make sense of a truth being innate and yet not assented to than I can of a man's knowing a truth while being ignorant of it. All right. So there's his arguments against the speculative principles. So let's talk a little bit about the practical principles. And what do we mean by practical principles? So speculative principles, remember, are those ideas that about what is the true nature of reality, right? They're metaphysical claims. God exists. Right? That's saying a certain fact about reality. God does not exist. That's saying a certain fact about reality. Compare that to what we'll call moral principles. And these are principles about what ought to be the case rather than what actually is the case. What should be true. All right? So we're making certain moral claims here. Now, according to Locke, it should seem even more obvious that these moral principles are not innate, even more than the simple speculative principles that we were talking about, the non-moral principles we were just talking about before. There are no moral rules that has as much claim to immediate universal assent as it is impossible for the same thing to be and not to be. Therefore, the case against the innateness of practical principles is even stronger, right? With the case of speculative principles, they are self-evident. That is, but in the case of moral principles, we actually need to think about it for a bit, right? When you're told, is this right or wrong to do, you don't know it immediately. You understand it through some sort of pause and some careful deliberation about what is right and what is wrong. And when you're doing that, you need reasons to support your actual positions. You need some sort of reason to support what is morally right and what is morally wrong. It's not something which is so self-evident. Now, this does not detract from their truth or certainty. The fact that, say, 3 angles of a triangle are equal to 2 right angles is not evidently true, but it is true and certain. So there can be moral facts, and Locke certainly thinks that it is. He's a natural law theorist. We'll get to more of that next week when we get into his second treatise of government. Right, but there are certain truths about morality according to Locke. But like I said, we'll get to that next week, so let's hold off on that. All right, he says, it should be rather clear to anybody that there are no moral principles that everyone assents to. Most people seem to agree about justice and the keeping of contracts. Indeed, this principle is thought to be respected even among thieves and other villains, we're told. It is said that thieves and villains keep faith with one another. But they observe principles of justice merely as rules of convenience within their own communities, not as some sort of innate moral law. Right? Justice and truth are the common ties of society. And therefore, even outlaws and robbers and criminals, they keep faith in rules of fairness amongst themselves. For otherwise, their gangs would fall apart. You want to have a very good gang of robbers if nobody trusted each other. They have to have some sort of truth and some sort of justice that they can actually make sense of. But will anyone actually say that those who live by crime allow themselves to be guided by innate principles of truth and justice? Some object to this way of thinking. They'll say, well, criminals accept those principles even though they don't act on them. That criminals know what right and wrong is, but they just choose to do what is wrong. And here's Locke's response to that. He says, quote, I have always thought that men's actions are the best guide to their thoughts. Right? Men's actions are the best guide to their thoughts. Here's another objection that we need to consider. Isn't it possible that there are innate practical principles that show up in what men think but don't affect their behavior? Right? Is it possible, once again, is it possible that there are innate practical principles that show up in what men think but don't affect their behavior? That is, they know it innately, but they just act differently. Well, Locke looks at that and he says this is rather strange and unreasonable to accept. He says, besides, what makes a principle practical rather than speculative is their bearing upon action. I mean, when we think about what morality is, whatever your position on what moral theory is right, fundamentally, morality is inherently about our actions. So, when we're judging somebody, we got to go by their actions. We can't get into somebody's mind and understand what they're thinking. We go by their actions. Some will say, as an objection to Locke, will say that there is a practical kind that is innate in all mankind and influences all our actions. And that is, it's a desire for happiness and aversion to misery. This is sort of like a foundation for another theory called utilitarianism, which we might talk about later in the semester. Here's the thing. We're not going to say that aversion to misery and a desire for happiness, is that going to be our moral truths? For Locke, he says this has to do with what we want, not what our moral beliefs are. That is, there are natural tendencies imprinted on the minds of men. So, for example, we have likes and dislikes, but this does not amount to having innate principles of moral knowledge. Right? My, say, dislike of cilantro is not necessarily a bad thing, right? Right? We have likes, we have dislikes, right? These are not ideas in and of themselves. So let's consider another argument against any sort of innate practical principles. Well, it seems possible that one can fairly ask for a reason for any moral rule. Right? Think about that. So if you want to say, hey, is this right or is this wrong? I can ask you for a reason of why you think this is right or why you think this is wrong. But remember, if these moral truths were innate, why would I ask you the question of what is right or wrong? If they're innate, I already know the answer because they're imprinted upon my mind. Asking any sort of reason for some sort of moral rule would not make any sort of sense. It would be completely pointless. The fact that we do need to ask for reasons for moral rules suggests that they're not innate and that should be more self-evident. So, excuse me for a sec. So to ask about a reason for a moral principle, that would be ridiculous and absurd if, in fact, these moral reasons were, in fact, innate. All right, another argument. It goes like this. The truth of all moral rules depend on some underlying rules from which they must be deduced. This could not be so if they were innate, or even if they were merely self-evident. Therefore, according to Locke, moral rules are not innate. Here's an objection to this argument. What about the universal moral rule that men should keep their promises? Right, isn't that undeniable? Isn't it undeniable that you should be a man of your word, that if you promise to do something, that you actually follow through on this? That should be undeniable, right? Even if we were to say that there's some sort of universal assent to this, according to Locke, the reason why people hold this rule is different. It's not the same, right? They reason from different perspectives. Men's opinions concerning moral rules vary greatly according to the different sorts of happiness that they aim at. So let's take a look. For example, let's ask men why a man must keep his word, and they will answer differently. All right, so we're going to ask a group of people the same question, and they're going to answer differently. Now remember, if they were innate, these ideas were truly innate and imprinted upon the mind, we would all have the same reasons for holding them, right? Because they were imprinted upon the mind. They would be natural to us. So if you were to ask a Christian of why should a man keep his word, a Christian will say because God, who has the power of eternal life and death, requires him to do so. You can ask, there was a philosopher he brings up by the name of Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes was another modern philosopher earlier to Locke. But if you were to ask, he says, Hobbes, why is it man should keep his word? It's because the public requires it and that the state's going to punish you if you don't do it. But if you ask one of the ancient philosophers, right, they're going to say something like, because breaking promises is dishonest, below the dignity of man, the opposite to virtue, which is, of course, the highest perfection of human nature, right? If you go back and think of Socrates and Plato, and you kind of get this, like the need for justice, the overwhelming importance of that Socrates actually held all the way up to his death. Okay, so why are these rules universal? All right, that man should keep his word if they're not innate. Well, he says this: the reason these rules are universal is not because they are innate, but because God firmly joined virtue and public happiness together and made virtuous conduct necessary to the preservation of society and visibly beneficial to everyone the virtuous man has dealings with. So you can think of it this way. God has created the world in such a way where those that work and play well with others, they're going to be more successful in life, and it's going to be beneficial to them, right? So it's beneficial to them to work and play well with others, and this is just universally true. And so those that happen to do that are going to be considered, more moral, and they're going to, recognize the moral truth that a man should be a man of his word. All right. Men, he says, accept and recommend and praise them to other people out of the advantage to himself. But this is an outward acceptance of the rule. If rules were innate, we'd only have to look inward into our own mind. And if we can't do that, therefore, rules are not innate. An objection to this, some might say, well, men's consciousness help to prevent them from breaking the rules, showing that there is, after all, an internal sense of being obliged by them. Right? So you have this conscience which is telling you to act right, don't do wrong, right? Here's his response, right? To quote, men can come to assent to various moral rules in the same way that they come to the knowledge of other things. without the rules being written on their hearts. And others may be led the same way by their education, the company they keep, the customs of their country. Such an assent to the rules will activate the conscience, which is nothing but our own opinion or judgment of the moral rightness or wrongness of our own actions. If conscience is a proof of innateness, then contradictions can be innate principles, because sometimes men will conscientiously promote what others conscientiously avoid. Right? So my conscience might tell me what is right, and your conscience can say the same action is wrong, and so we're in some sort of contradiction here. How could that be if these were innate moral principles? This doesn't make any sort of sense for Locke. Okay, another reason to reject the innate moral principles is if moral principles really were innate, how could anybody confidently and serenely ever break them? Right? If you really knew what was right and wrong, it was innate in your mind, why would you ever do wrong? I mean, wouldn't that just harm you all the time, harm you in the end? I think going back to Plato here and in the Republic, talking about justice, does the just man profit over the unjust man? Thrasymachus, Glaucon, you probably remember that. Here's his response, he says, of how we know that their moral principles are not universally imprinted. He says, look at an army sacking a town. Look for signs of soldiers obeying or having some sense of moral principles, some feeling, some touch of conscience over the outrages that are being performed. What happens in war? You have robberies, murders, rapes. These are all the sports of men who are not threatened with punishment. Right? When people are not threatened with punishment, if they could do whatever they want, look at all the horrible stuff they do. Have there not been whole nations? And those are the most civilized people amongst whom they're exposing their children, leaving them in the fields to die of hunger or from wild beasts, have been the practice. Look at the entire history of mankind, Locke says. Look without prejudice at their actions. You should be able to satisfy yourself that there is hardly a principle of morality to be named or a rule of virtue to be thought of that is not somewhere in the world slighted and condemned by the general fashion of whole societies who live by moral views and rules that are quite opposite to ours. Some people will object to this and say, well, just because a rule is being broken, that doesn't prove that it's not known. And Locke says, okay, true, strictly speaking, that's true, but it's impossible to conceive that a whole nation of men should all publicly reject and renounce what every one of them certainly and infallibly knew to be moral law. I mean, it's one thing to say, well, this person knew what was right and wrong and chose to do wrong. Right? And so that doesn't prove that's not innate. But can you imagine? Why is it entire societies hold those views of what another entire society thinks is wrong? Right? This doesn't make any sense. If it was truly natural to our brain and it was imprinted upon our mind, why would that be the case? Can you really conceive that? I mean, it's not just one person, but the whole of society. The whole society recognizes what right and wrong is, but all of society chooses wrong anyways. That doesn't make a lot of sense to Locke. So there's a problem there. Should we really believe that whole nations of men should, in both speech and actions, give the lie to what every one of them knew for certain to be true, right, and good? No practical rule can be supposed to be innate if any part of the world it is transgressed universally and with public approval, or at least without disapproval. All right, so Locke's going to go ahead and conclude Book 1 this way. He says, quote, "From what I have said, I think we may safely conclude that no principle is innate, if it is in any place generally allowed to be broken, for it is impossible that men should confidently and serenely break a rule that they knew had been set by God, who would certainly punish any breach of it so severely as to make the transgression a poor bargain." All right, so what have we just gone over? We looked at two different types of ideas. We got speculative principles and we got practical principles. And Locke is arguing against what people like Plato and Descartes have been saying, that all of these ideas are innate and that everybody just knows them by the nature of reason. Locke is, I think, given a pretty good case for why this knowledge is in fact not innate and that it's actually something that we come to learn. So, if you have any questions, please go ahead and email me, and I will answer as soon as I possibly can. I hope this was helpful, a little discussion into, empiricism and innate ideas. All right. I hope you guys are staying safe. Stay home, stay safe, and stay healthy.